Hi, I'm Victor Canet. First of all, I want to say happy Easter celebration to you and your family. We spend a lot of time in the flourishing science community asking, what I believe to be a deceptively simple question. What does it mean for a human being to truly thrive and flourish? Easter, I believe, it's one of the most profound answers the world has ever been offered to that question. Now, think about what the resurrection narrative even represents or presents to us. You have a man who entered the fullness of suffering. He experienced displacement. He experienced betrayal. He experienced the severing of every social bond that he had. He even experienced physical death itself. In my research on human flourishing, I call the pattern that precedes despair the protest despair detachment sequence. In other words, you could say even that you see it all in the day leading up to Easter. The cry of abandonment from the cross that we see with Jesus, I don't think it's weakness. It is actually the honest voice of someone whose attachments and connections have been stripped to nothing. That, I believe, it's where flourishing goes to die. But Easter says that in itself is not the end of the story. It is not the end of our story. The resurrection, I believe, is at its core a statement about human possibility and agency. It kind of says that the disruptors, the psychological disturbances that we experience, things like loss, things like displacement, things like ruptured bonds, that these disruptors do not have the final word. That meaning can be remade regardless of what happens in our life, that we can shape the story and the life that we want for ourselves and for our future generation. In other words, meaning can be remade through suffering, through loss, through displacement. That what looks like permanent detachment or permanent loss can become the beginning of the deepest kind of connection. In fact, in our global flourishing study, where we studied over 200,000 people across 22 countries, we actually find again and again that people who report the highest levels of well-being are not those who have avoided suffering. Think about people from developing countries like Indonesia, Mexico, Philippines, all of which were really reporting higher levels of flourishing, different flourishing indicators. They, I believe, the people who had the highest, who are flourishing, are those who have found a way through their suffering towards something larger than themselves. Some call that hope. They've also found forgiveness. They've also found the capacity to imagine a future that does not look like their past. Easter, I think, is a cosmic version of that finding. And notice who Jesus appears to first after his resurrection. He did not appear to the powerful. He did not appear to a religious establishment. He appears to a grieving woman in a garden, someone in the depths of mourning, someone that was disoriented, looking for a body. The first flourishing encounter of the post-resurrection world is with someone who has every reason to believe that flourishing, it's over. And that, I think, it's not accidental, because it tells us something about where the seeds of human thriving tend to be planted. It is usually planted in the very soil of our losses. So what does Easter ask of us then? I think that it asks of us to take seriously that restoration is possible. To take seriously that regardless of what we've lost in life, that it's still possible to recover it. Not just spiritually, though I believe we recover it spiritually, but also psychologically. We'll recover whatever that's lost relationally. We'll recover whatever that we've lost, even in our community. And so the resurrection is not only an event that even happens to one body in first century Jerusalem. It is an invitation to a whole orientation towards life, a life of abundance, that like endings in relationships, in community, in our own sense of self can become the new ground of something new. Now, I believe that in the languages of flourishing science, we call this post-traumatic growth. We call it meaning. We call it resilience. But the New Testament calls it resurrection. I think it is simply pointing at the same mysterious reality from different angles. Some also call it abundant life. At least in my lab, we call it abundant life. So this Easter, wherever you find yourself, whether you're in the joy of the empty tomb or still sitting in the grief of Holy Saturday, still waiting, still not sure that the stone will roll over, I want you to hear this. I want to offer you this in particular. Flourishing is not a straight line. It is never a linear journey. It is not the absence of disruptors or things that shatter our lives. It is not the absence of loss. It is not the absence of suffering. It is not the absence of pain. It is what happens when human beings, wired as I believe we are for connection and meaning and hope, when we refuse to let the final story be told by our deepest losses. Easter is not a nice idea, but a chain that the universe bends towards restoration. Easter is a story of trauma and suffering and betrayal. But even in that story, the universe bends towards restoration. That, I think, is the very good news of Easter. So regardless of what you're going through this season of life, tap into the power and the anointing that exists in Easter and experience the resurrection and the restoration that you've been yearning for. Happy Easter, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. God bless.